Imagine walking through a door that hasn't been opened in 60 years. The hinges scream. Not loudly, just a low, tired groan, like something waking from a very long sleep. Your footsteps land on terrazzo floors that were once polished to a mirror shine, and now they're covered in a thin layer of dust that rises with every step, catching the light that filters through broken Venetian blinds. The air smells like old paper, like rust, like time itself has settled into the walls and decided to stay. And then you stop. Because in the corner of this room that hasn't held a human being in decades, there's a glass syringe sitting on a metal tray, perfectly placed, as if someone just set it down for a moment and stepped out to answer a question and simply never came back. This is what's left of the 1950s hospital, not a ruin exactly. Something stranger than that, a memory that forgot to disappear, and today we're going inside. We're going to walk the hallways that were once filled with the quiet shuffling of nurses in white uniforms and the soft murmur of patients who were told they were going to be just fine. We're going to understand why these buildings, enormous, beautiful, haunting, were designed to feel like home. And then we're going to confront something most people don't want to talk about, what was actually happening inside those walls, why the warmth was, in many cases, a disguise, and why these places, which were once considered the pinnacle of modern care, were eventually abandoned, sealed up, and left to rot. Because the story of the 1950s medical facility is not just a story about architecture or medicine. It's a story about what we believed human beings deserved, and what we were willing to do to them when no one was watching. Let's start at the beginning. After the Second World War, America was rebuilding itself with a kind of furious optimism that we've never quite seen since. Soldiers had come home, families were forming, suburbs were expanding out into what had once been countryside, and the country was flush with a sense of possibility, the feeling that science had saved the world, and that it could now save everything else. Medicine was riding the same wave. Penicillin had changed warfare. Surgery was becoming safer. The idea that disease could be conquered, that suffering could be managed, that modern facilities could transform the experience of illness. This was not just a hope. It was a national project. In 1946, the United States government passed the Hill-Burton Act, one of the most significant pieces of healthcare legislation in American history. It allocated hundreds of millions of dollars, eventually billions, for the construction and modernization of hospitals across the country. The goal was simple on paper: make sure that every American, regardless of where they lived, had access to a hospital bed within a reasonable distance. But the implementation of that goal produced something that, when you look at the photographs today, takes your breath away. These were not the hospitals we know. Walk into any modern hospital and you know exactly where you are within seconds. The fluorescent lights, the linoleum floors in that specific shade of gray that isn't quite gray, the smell of antiseptic so strong it coats the back of your throat, the sounds, the constant electronic percussion of monitors and pumps and alarms, a rhythm that never stops. That follows you into the elevator and through the corridors and into rooms where people are trying to sleep. Modern hospitals are efficient. They are optimized. They communicate through every surface and every sound that you are inside a machine. The 1950s hospital said something completely different. The architects who designed these facilities were operating under a philosophy that we have largely abandoned, and that philosophy was this: a sick person is a frightened person, and a frightened person does not heal. So the job of the building is not just to house medicine. The job of the building is to calm the mind. And so they chose color. Not white. White was considered cold, clinical, frightening. The walls of 1950s hospitals were painted in pastels, soft pinks and warm greens and gentle blues that wrapped around patients like a kind of visual reassurance. These colors were not chosen by accident. They were the result of actual research into the psychology of illness, into what shades made people feel safe, what tones reduced anxiety, what hues were associated not with sterility, but with comfort, with nature, with home. The floors were often terrazzo, patterned, almost decorative. The ceilings had moldings. There were curtains on the windows, not just blinds, and those curtains were sometimes patterned with flowers or simple geometric designs. The kind of thing you might find in a living room in a suburb somewhere, the kind of thing that said, "This is not a place to be afraid of. This is a place where people live," and the spaces were extraordinary. These hospitals had gardens. Real ones, not the small, slightly sad courtyards you sometimes find attached to modern medical facilities, but actual gardens with grass and benches, and trees that patients could walk through, or sit beside, or simply look at through large windows that were designed specifically to bring the outside in. There were dining halls where patients who were mobile enough would come together for meals, actual communal meals served on trays that were not, by all accounts, terrible. There were libraries stocked with books and magazines. There were spaces specifically designed for what we might now call occupational therapy, but what then was simply called doing something. Rooms where patients could work with their hands, paint, read, talk, be human beings rather than medical cases. The nurses' stations were not the glass-enclosed fortresses of surveillance they became later. They were integrated into the ward, approachable, designed to encourage the kind of quiet conversation between patient and caregiver that was understood, instinctively, to be part of treatment. You could ask a question without feeling like you were interrupting something. You could make a request without pressing a button and waiting for a voice through a speaker. And the silence. This is the thing that people who were patients in those facilities, the ones who are old enough to remember, talk about most. The silence. Not a total silence. There were footsteps and voices, and the distant sound of a radio playing something gentle somewhere down the hall, but not the mechanical noise of the modern hospital. Not the constant, inescapable beeping that has become so normalized in contemporary healthcare that patients routinely describe it as one of the most distressing aspects of their stay. In the 1950s hospital, the machines were few enough and quiet enough that you could hear yourself think. You could hear, if you were very still, the sound of the garden through an open window. If you close your eyes and imagine it, something happens in your chest, something that is not quite sadness but is close to it, a sense of loss for something you may never have experienced, a grief for a version of care that, in its surfaces and its intentions, was genuinely trying to treat the whole person and not just the disease. But here is where we have to take a breath. Here is where the story turns. Because behind those soft pastel walls, behind the gardens and the dining halls and the carefully chosen colors, something else was happening. Something that the aesthetics were never designed to reveal. Something that, when we look at it directly, makes the beauty of these buildings feel less like comfort and more like a mask. The 1950s was not a golden age of medicine. It was a frontier, and frontiers are brutal places. Patient rights, as we understand them today, did not exist. There was no informed consent in any meaningful sense. A doctor could recommend a treatment, could decide on a treatment, and that was largely the end of the discussion. The patient, particularly if they were poor, or female, or a person of color, or if they had been committed to a psychiatric facility, had almost no legal recourse, no avenue of appeal. No one whose job it was to protect them from whatever the institution decided was in their interest. And the institutions decided some things that are very difficult to look at now. Lobotomy was not a fringe procedure in the 1950s. It was mainstream. It was Nobel Prize-winning. Walter Freeman, the most famous lobotomist in American history, drove across the country in a van he called the Lobotomobile. performing procedures at hospitals and institutions in city after city. His technique, the transorbital lobotomy, performed with something that looked disturbingly like an ice pick, inserted through the eye socket and into the brain, took less than 10 minutes and required nothing more than local anesthesia. He performed it on people who were depressed, people who were anxious, people who were, by contemporary standards, completely ordinary human beings who were struggling with their lives and had ended up in a system that had decided to handle their struggle by disconnecting the frontal lobe of their brain from the rest of it. Patients who underwent this procedure sometimes became calmer. They also sometimes lost the ability to feel much of anything at all. They lost initiative, personality, the specific texture of who they had been. They came out of those beautiful, pastel-colored rooms as quieter, emptier versions of themselves, and the institution called this a success. Electroconvulsive therapy, shock treatment, as it was commonly known, was administered in the 1950s in ways that bear almost no resemblance to the carefully monitored, anesthesia-assisted procedure that exists today. Patients were often not sedated. They were strapped to tables or held down by attendants while electrical current was passed through their brains, inducing seizures that could break teeth and fracture bones. Some patients described the experience as waking up in the middle of a nightmare they couldn't understand. Some had no memory of it afterward. Some developed a terror of the treatment that stayed with them for the rest of their lives, and they received it anyway, again and again, because the doctor had decided it was therapeutic, and no one was required to ask the patient how they felt about it. And then there was the space itself, the beautiful, generous space that we just spent so long admiring. The large psychiatric facilities of the 1950s, the state hospitals, the asylums that had been built in the previous century and were now bursting under the pressure of post-war patient populations, were catastrophically overcrowded. A facility built for 500 patients might be housing 1,500. Beds were placed in hallways. Patients slept two to a mattress. Bathrooms designed for dozens served hundreds. The garden, if it still existed, was no longer a therapeutic space. It was a yard, fenced, supervised, a place where patients walked in circles because there was nowhere else to go. Staff were overwhelmed. Not because they were uncaring, many of them were dedicated, exhausted people doing impossible work, but because the ratio of caregivers to patients had become so distorted that basic human dignity was a luxury the system could no longer afford. People were warehoused. That is the word that historians use, and it is an ugly word because it is an accurate one. The beautiful buildings were full of people who were not receiving care. They were receiving containment. In the corridors that smelled of floor wax and institutional food, in the rooms with the gentle pastel walls, people were suffering in ways that the architecture was specifically designed to conceal. The home-like aesthetic was not just a psychological tool for patients. It was a public relations gesture. It said to the outside world, "We are taking care of these people. Don't worry. Don't look too closely. Trust us." And for a while the world did, but buildings like secrets have a way of giving themselves away eventually. The first thing that started to go wrong was money. The facilities that had been built with Hill-Burton funding were expensive to maintain in ways that no one had fully calculated at the time of construction. These were enormous buildings, some of them covering dozens of acres, with multiple wings and hundreds of rooms and miles of plumbing and electrical wiring running through their walls. To heat them in winter required industrial quantities of fuel. To cool them in summer, as air conditioning became an expectation rather than a luxury, required infrastructure that many of these buildings simply weren't designed to accommodate. The maintenance costs began to outpace the budgets, And budgets in the world of public health care are always the final argument. Then came the chemistry. The buildings of the 1950s were constructed with materials that were, at the time, considered perfectly safe. Asbestos was everywhere in the insulation around pipes, in the ceiling tiles, in the floor materials, in the adhesives used to attach surfaces to walls. It was cheap, it was effective, and it was, as the medical and construction industries would spend the next several decades discovering in increasingly horrifying detail, a direct cause of mesothelioma and other fatal lung diseases. Lead paint covered the walls in many facilities, including the beautiful pastel walls we just described. The windows were sealed with materials that off-gassed chemicals we now know to be carcinogenic. The buildings that were supposed to heal people were slowly poisoning them. And once this became clear, once the legal and financial implications of the asbestos crisis began to be understood, the calculus changed entirely. Remediating these buildings, stripping out the dangerous materials and replacing them, was in many cases more expensive than simply closing the facility and walking away. And so across the country that is what happened. Doors were locked, staff were transferred or let go. Patients were moved, in many cases with very little notice and very little preparation, to smaller facilities or to community care arrangements that were, in the early days of deinstitutionalization, vastly underprepared to receive them. And deinstitutionalization is the third part of this story, and in some ways the most complicated. In 1963, President Kennedy signed the Community Mental Health Act, which represented a fundamental shift in how the American government thought about psychiatric care. The idea, rooted in genuine humanitarian concern and in early research, suggesting that community-based treatment could be more effective than institutional care, was that patients should not be locked away in large facilities. They should be treated in their communities, in smaller clinics in outpatient settings, supported by networks of local care that would allow them to remain integrated in the world rather than separated from it. It was, in principle, a compassionate idea. In practice, the community infrastructure that was supposed to receive these patients was never fully built. The funding that was supposed to flow into community mental health centers arrived slowly, partially, inconsistently. The large institutions emptied out faster than the alternatives could be constructed. And the patients who had spent years, in some cases, decades, inside those facilities found themselves released into a world that did not have the systems in place to support them. The building sat empty, and this is where something very strange happens. This is where the story takes a turn that is harder to explain but impossible to ignore. When a building that was designed around human beings, a building whose entire architecture was oriented toward warmth, toward home, toward care, is suddenly emptied of human beings, it doesn't just become a ruin. It becomes something else. It becomes a kind of monument to intention, to the gap between what we wanted to do and what we actually did. And it preserves, in a way that nothing else quite does, the specific texture of a moment in time. The urban explorers and photographers who have documented these abandoned facilities in recent decades have brought back images that are almost impossible to process. A nurse's station where the clipboards are still hanging on the wall, the patient names still legible on the paper. A ward where the metal beds are still arranged in their rows, still made up with the thin institutional blankets that were never comfortable but were always there. A treatment room where the equipment is still in place, not antique exactly, but not quite real either, occupying a strange middle space between artifact and memory. A glass syringe on a metal tray. Still there, still waiting. These objects are not just old things, they are witnesses. They were present for things that happened in those rooms, things that in many cases were never fully recorded, never fully acknowledged, never fully processed by the people who experienced them, or by the institution that decided they should happen. They carry a weight that is not supernatural. This is not a ghost story, or not only a ghost story, but that is not nothing either. It is the weight of unfinished business, of questions that were never asked because asking them was not part of the system. In some of these facilities, the patient records are still there. Filing cabinets full of paper, the ink fading but still legible, containing the histories of people who were admitted and treated and sometimes discharged and sometimes not. People whose families, in some cases, never came looking. People who were simply absorbed by the institution and then released by it without ceremony, without explanation, without anyone tracking where they went or what happened to them afterward. There are names in those files, real names. People who existed, who had lives before they arrived at those doors, who had families and histories and inner experiences that were reduced, for the purposes of the institutional record, to a diagnosis and a treatment plan and a discharge date, or no discharge date at all. Who were they? What happened to them? What did the treatment feel like from the inside, from the side of the bed rather than the side of the chart? These are questions that the buildings raise but cannot answer. They are questions that float in the dust that rises from those terrazzo floors, that hang in the air that smells like rust and old paper and time. And this is the thing about these places that gets under your skin and stays there. They are not just failures. They are also, genuinely, attempts. Imperfect, sometimes deeply harmful, sometimes cruel in ways that the people responsible may not have understood as cruelty, but attempts nonetheless. The architect who chose the pastel colors was trying to do something good. The administrator who planted the garden was trying to do something good. The nurse who organized the library was trying to do something good. And the fact that the system surrounding these gestures was broken, was exploitative, was producing harm alongside care, this doesn't erase the gestures. It just makes them more painful to look at. We do not live in a world without these problems. We live in a world where they have been partially addressed, where some safeguards exist that didn't exist then, where informed consent is a legal requirement and patient rights are at least nominally protected. But we also live in a world where the psychiatric care system is still underfunded, where community mental health infrastructure is still inadequate, where people who need institutional support sometimes can't find it, and people who are in institutional settings sometimes suffer in ways that aren't so different from what happened behind those pastel walls. The 1950s hospital is not history in the sense of something over and resolved. It is history in the sense of a pattern that we are still inside of, that we haven't fully broken free from, that keeps reasserting itself in new forms and new contexts. The buildings are gone, most of them, demolished or stripped and converted into condominiums or left to slowly collapse into themselves. The ones that remain are protected by distance and decay, and the particular kind of cultural forgetting that attaches itself to places that held too much pain to be looked at directly. But some of them are still there. Some of them are still standing in fields at the edges of cities, or on hilltops where they were placed deliberately, because the elevation was believed to promote healthy air circulation, or tucked into the corners of campuses that grew up around them and then outgrew them. They stand with their windows broken, and their roofs beginning to give way, and their pastel paint peeling off in long curling strips that fall to floors where no one has walked in 30 or 40 or 50 years. And if you stand outside one of them in the late afternoon, when the light is coming in at that particular angle that makes old buildings look like they're lit from within, you can almost hear it. The soft footsteps, the distant murmur, the sound of someone's radio playing something gentle somewhere down the hall. The particular quality of a silence that is full rather than empty, full of everything that happened there, everything that was tried and failed and hoped and suffered. These buildings are time capsules in the most literal and most unsettling sense. They contain, in their bones, a complete picture of what we believed about sickness and healing and human dignity at a specific moment in our history. They show us what we got right, the instinct toward beauty, toward community, toward making frightening things feel safe. And they show us with equal clarity what we got catastrophically wrong. They are monuments to the distance between intention and outcome, between the building and what happened inside it, between the story we told about care and the reality of what care actually looked like for the people who needed it most. Standing in front of one of these abandoned hospitals, if you're lucky enough, or perhaps unlucky enough, to find one still standing, you feel something that is very hard to name. It is not nostalgia exactly, because nostalgia implies a wish to go back, and no honest engagement with this history produces a wish to go back. It is something more like grief, and something more like recognition. The recognition that human beings at any given moment in history are doing their best with what they know, and that what they know is always incomplete, always partial, always shadowed by blind spots they can't see because those blind spots are, by definition, invisible to them. The doctors who performed lobotomies in those beautiful, peaceful rooms believed they were helping. The administrators who built the gardens and the dining halls and the libraries believed they were building something humane, and they were, and they weren't. Both things are true simultaneously, and the tension between them doesn't resolve, it just sits there in the dust, waiting. The glass syringe on the metal tray, the patient files in the cabinet, the ink fading, the names still legible. The pastel walls beneath the peeling paint, still the same color they were the day someone chose them, because they thought that color could make a frightened person feel safe. These things persist. And they ask us something. They ask us what we are doing right now today, in the facilities and systems and institutions that we have built to manage human suffering. That seems perfectly reasonable to us. That seems necessary and humane, and obviously correct, that the people who come after us will look back at and recognize as incomplete, as partial, as shadowed by the blind spots we cannot see. Every generation believes it has finally gotten it right. Every generation leaves behind buildings full of evidence that it hadn't quite. The 1950s hospital tried to feel like home, and in some ways it succeeded, in its colors and its gardens and its libraries and its instinct toward human warmth. And in some ways it failed completely, in its ethics, in its overcrowding, in the treatments it administered to people who had no power to refuse them. And then it was abandoned, sealed, left to the dust and the silence and the long afternoon light. And here we are, looking in through the broken window. Now I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it seriously before you answer, because it's not a simple question. If you had been a patient in one of these facilities, if you had walked through those doors, seen those soft colors, sat in that garden, felt that quiet, and you didn't know what was happening behind the closed doors, in the treatment rooms, in the filing cabinets, would the beauty have been enough? Would the attempt at home have felt like home? And is there something we are living inside of right now, something that looks and feels to us like progress, like care, like the right way to do things, that people 60 years from now will look back at the way we're looking at these buildings? Tell me in the comments. I genuinely want to know what you think.